So today's daf is daf Ayin Vav, and we start at the top with the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is addressing how you prepare the mincha and what is the rule. And there are two actions that are required in order to prepare the mincha. Number one is we need something called shifa, and kol menachos tu'unis shloshmel shifa. So the shifa means that you rub it, and we'll see why. And then there's another action that's required, which is called be'ito, which is pounding. The chamesh meot and require 500 poundings. So there are two possible ways of explaining why we need shifa and be'ita, these rubbings and the poundings. One way is to get rid of the husks, or at least soften the husks, so that later on the husks will fall off on their own, because we need soles, we need pure flour without husks. Another way of explaining it is that the Mishnah is not referring at all to the natural natural state of the kernels, but rather to the dough. After you made it into a dough, that's when you need the shifa and the be'it in order to soften and flatten out the dough. So first we have the shita of the Tanakama, shifa ube'ita bechitin. So we're talking about the kernels of wheat themselves, way before you made them into dough, and that's, as we said before, to loosen the husks. However, Rabbi Yossi disagrees, and he says no, the shifa and the be'ita refer to the batzek after it was made into a dough, as we said, to flatten it out and make sure that it's uniform. Now the Mishnah presents a machlokas between the Tanakama and Rabbi Meir. Tanakama here is Rabbi Yehuda, regarding how many lachamim, how many loaves we need for any particular mincha. And the question is, what's the rule and what's the exception to the rule? So we'll start with the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. Kol menachos bos eser eser. So the number of loaves that we need for any given mincha is always going to be 10, with two exceptions. Chutz milechem aponim, where we require 12 lechamim, and chavite kohen gadol, the daily, twice daily carbon mincha of the kohen gadol, which is called minchas chavite, and that also requires 12. Shebos shtemisrei. So again, the general rule according to Rabbi Yehuda, with the exception of two cases, is groups of 10 loaves. However, Rabbi Meir has it the other way around. Kulam, the general rule is bos shtemisrei. We need 12 loaves. And the exception where we suffice with 10 is chutz mi chalos toda, right? So chalos toda is made up of 40 lechamim that are subdivided into 4 categories, and each category has 10 lechamim, and then we have nazirus. And when we're talking about nazirus here, we're talking about a person who completes his nazirus. He has to bring a series of 3 karbanos. Amongst them, one of them is called a shlomim, and the carbon shlomim of a nazir has to be accompanied by chalos and rekikin, as the Torah specifies it in Parshas Naso, towards the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar. So the general rule, according to Rabbi Meir, with the exception of chalos, toda, and nazirus, is 12 loaves. But in the cases of chalos, toda, and nazirus, it's going to be 10 loaves. Now the Gemara quotes a brisa that says the following: Shaf achas. The way he does it, he doesn't do shifa of 300 times and then begin his be'ita, but rather he integrates it. So, for example, he'll start with one shifa, one rubbing, and then there's a ratio here of 300 to 500, and therefore now he'll be boet shtayim. Then he goes back to shifa, and he's shaf shtayim. We'll see exactly what that means, whether it's in both directions or one direction. In any event, boet sholosh. So it keeps going up from one, and then you need two be'itos, to two shifos, and then three be'itos, and it keeps going on. And at the end of the culmination of this entire process, you reach the level of 300 shifos and 500 be'itos. Boy Rabbi Yirmiyah, what does it mean, shifa? Tuye vasuye chad. How do you calculate it? Let's say, for example, he rolls it back and then he rolls it forth, or forth and back. Is that counted as one or as two? Or tuye trey? Is my take. Gemara leaves it as an unresolved question. Shifa be'ita b'chitin, Rabbi Yossi Yomi b'botzek, iboilahu. B'botzek v'lo b'chitin, was Rabbi Yossi adding another additional requirement of shifa and be'ita, but he accepts the basic, and that's called odilma af b'botzek, af, meaning that it's not enough to do the shifa and the be'ita on the chitin, you have to do it on the dough. Or be'botzek v'lo b'chitin, or Rabbi Yossi substitutes the be'ita of the botzek for that of chitin. He doesn't require it in chitin. Tashma, let's bring a proof from the sign from a brisa. Shifa u'be'ita b'chitin. Rabbi Yossi Omer, shifa u'be'ita b'botzek. So if we're very careful about this brisa, the brisa seems to indicate that all Rabbi Yossi requires is the shifa, the be'ita, b'botzek. He doesn't say af shifa u'be'ita b'botzek, but rather he substitutes the botzek for the chitin, and he does not require shifa u'be'ita in chitin. The Mishnah says, Kol Menachos pos shtemesrei, and this is the shita of Rabbi Meir, the second shita in our Mishnah. And the exception is going to be lechem hapanim, which require 12, and chavite kohen gadol, which once again require 12. But other than that, the general rule is that 10 loaves is more than enough. Now we want to know, where do we find the source in the Torah for the admission or confession of Rabbi Meir that there are two cases in which you need 12 chalos, 12 lechamim, and they are lechem aponim and the shalmi nazir. So Gemara says the following: lechem aponim behed yiksiv bei. That's explicit in the Torah. The Torah says, "V'lakachta soles v'afisa osa shtem asrei chalos." So you can't ask me, how do you know 12 when the Torah says it explicitly? However, what about chavite kohen gadol? There the Torah doesn't specify that it's 12 loaves. Asya chuka chuka, we have a gzeira shava chuka chuka milechem haponim. Right, the Torah says explicitly lechem haponim is 12 loaves. And now we introduce a gzeira shava chuka chuka. And that's going to teach me that also in the case of the Shalmi Nazir, you also require 12 lechamim. I'm sorry, did I say Shalmi Nazir?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So 1 second. Let's just make sure we got this straight. We have to discuss the 12 loaves according to Rabbi Meir in the two cases of Chalos Toda and Nazirus. Okay, so I stand corrected. It's referring to the Shlamim of the Nazir. And just like the Lechem Aponim requires 12 loaves, so too the Shlamim require. Second. Just give me 1 second here because he says it a little differently here. Just 1 second. Ah, let's go back to Rabbi Yehuda's Shita. Rabbi Yehuda's Shita was that the general rule that applies to all menachos is 10 loaves. The exceptions to the rule are lechem aponim, which is explicit in the Torah that the Torah says shtemesrei. And now, what about the second exception to the rule according to Rabbi Yehuda, and that's chavitim of a kohen gadol. And for that, we're going to have a gzeir shav of chukah from lechem aponim. Now, fine, we have now clear indication that in these two cases of lechem aponim and chavite kohen gadol, we require 12. According to Rabbi Yehuda, all the remaining menachos require only 10. So the Gemara asks, Kol menachos debos eser minolan, what's the source for the number 10 as the general rule for all menachos? Gomer milachme toda. Right? In the case of lachme toda, the Torah says 10 for each of the four groups of lechamim. And in fact, if we recall the sheet of Rabbi Meir, who holds that the general rule is shtemesrei, lachmei toda become the exception to the rule because lachmei toda require only 10. And therefore, says Rabbi Yehuda, we're going to derive from lachmei toda the conclusion that chavite kohen gadol likewise require 10 loaves. Gomar milachmei toda malahalon eser afkan eser. But now we have a problem. Why do you choose to use your paradigmic case lachmei toda? And since lachmei toda are 10, right? Therefore, we're going to assume that the 1 second. Right. We're going to assume that lachmei toda is the paradigmic case from which we derive all menachos, according to Rabbi Yehuda, to tell you that all menachos come 10. So you've got a good case from lachmei toda, but the Gemara asks the following kasha: leilif mi lechem aponim. Lechem aponim is 12 chalos, and that's explicit. And say therefore that malahalon shtei misrei afkan shtei misrei. In other words, the Gemara is basically challenging Rabbi Yehuda from the logic of his bar plukta, namely Rabbi Meir. And according to Rabbi Meir, our paradigmic case will be lechem aponim. And yet, according to Rabbi Yehuda, lechem aponim becomes the exception to the rule rather than the rule. So the rule becomes 10, and lechem aponim is the exception, it's 12. And now the Gemara is saying, why do you use your paradigmic case from lachmei toda? Why not choose, instead of lachmei toda, choose lechem aponim? And instead of the archetypal number of loaves for any menachos being lachmei toda, which is 10, why not use lechem aponim, which is going to be 12? So the Gemara answers, Mistabra, it's more logical that milachmei toda, if we should really derive every menacha from lachmei toda becomes the paradigm, and that's the number 10. And why is that so? Shekain yachid, right? An individual brings a carbon tamid. And not only that, shemen, it has to include oil. Furthermore, Shalom b'Shabbos, we do not offer lachmei toda on Shabbos. Lachmei toda don't override Shabbos, which is a little bit tuma, and they don't override tuma. And all this is because it's a carbon yachid. So again, what we're saying now is that the similarities between all menachos and lachmei toda are airtight. They're very reliable. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, I don't get it. Adarabba. You want to choose the number 10 by setting up lachmei toda as your paradigm. I'm going to show you a carbon which requires 12. And that's milechem apanim avilelu melech. Why does your binyan of begin with lachmei toda and therefore you come to the conclusion that it's 10? Why not go with lechem apanim and therefore the number is 12? Now you might ask me, well, we just had a whole list of 4 comparisons between other menachos and the lachmei toda. What comparisons do you have with other menachos and lechem apanim? And the Gemara answers shekain. Number 1, hegdesh. Now, what does the word hegdesh mean here in this context? Kodshe kodshim. Lechem apanim and all menachos are kodshe kodshim. Carbon toda is kodshim kalim. And furthermore, levona might require levona in the case of lechem apanim. Matzah. Matzah here means that all 12 chalos of lechem apanim are matzah. I found this very surprising to me because I don't know if I saw this in books or where I saw it. When they have illustrations, I always saw the lechem apanim as like the most beautiful chalos. You know what I mean? I
Right.
never thought of them as matzos.
I thought
The
there was only
etzim,
like two.
what?
I thought there was only a couple of korvans that actually have matzah, like 30 and 10. I thought there's
Right.
very
Actually,
few.
I would say that most karbanos, I mean, leaving out shtei lechem, um, and 10 of the lachmei toda, most karbanos are with matzah, not with chametz.
Or with matzah?
Yeah, I think matzah, like lechem aponim is not an exception to the rule, but rather fits into the general rule.
Oh,
Even though we think of it as as lechem, but it's really matzah. Now we have something called etzem, which means that the lechem aponim are not coming to accompany any other carbon, whereas the lachmei toda are just accompanying the carbon toda. And the Gemara responds by saying, Hanach nefishin. There's a greater number of similarities between the carbon toda and other menachos as opposed to the lechem aponim. So therefore, we're going to choose the carbon toda, lachmei toda, as our paradigmic case of lechamim, and therefore we're going to require the number 10, according to Rabbi Yehuda, rather than lechem aponim, which is kind of different in the world of menachos, insofar as it's brought for the tzibur, not for the yochid, and so forth and so on. Okay. So Gemara has to find kash, like a kind of mimonafshach. Isfiralon davar alami b'gzer shava choser umalamed b'binyan av. So this is a question in Kodshim when you derive B from A in Gzeir Shava, can you then use B as a binyan av and expand that which you derived from Gzeir Shava? That's a real issue in the world of Kodshim. And now the Gemara is going to go through the different opinions. The first opinion the Gemara is going to analyze is that davar loving zer shava choser malamed b'binyanav. And therefore, based on that shita, we have a kasha, nelif mechavite kohen gadol. Now, chavite kohen gadol, um, 1 second, nelif mechavite kohen gadol. No, we came to the number 12 because of lechem aponim. Lechem aponim is explicitly 12 chalas. Then we extended that to the chavita and the kohen gadol through a gzeres shava. Now let's go a step further and extend it as a binyan av to other menachos. And that's what the Gemara says, Mala halon shtemesrei, just like in the case of chavitim, there are 12 chalos, is afkan, here too, every other mincha should be made of 12. And that indeed is the shita of Rabbi Meir. So Gemara answers no. Mistabra milachme toda, which is only 10, if we should derive it from all of the menachos from lachme toda, shekain hejot. Right, we're not going to use the case of chavitin of Kohen Gadol because, that's unique to the Kohen Gadol. It doesn't apply in general to the populace at large, the hediotos. And in that sense, we have a striking similarity to Lachmei Toda, because Lachmei Toda is also brought by a hedjot. Now let's go back again to show why Lachmei Toda becomes paradigmic for other menachos. Not only is it hedjot, but it's also shehisnadev. Now I'm not sure exactly what he means by shehisnadev. I mean, the truth is arba tzrichim lahodos, and you got to bring a korban toda. Maybe it means it lends itself to an adava, as opposed to chavitin, which is a korban chova incumbent upon the Kohen Gadol twice daily. Furthermore, what else do we see as a striking similarity to Lachmei Toda shehisnadev? I'm not exactly sure why that's called an adava. I mean, if he experienced that salvation, then I think he's required to bring the korban toda. All right. So that I don't know. Chatzoin. Which means that I think chatzon means here lo ba b'chatzon, meaning that the lachmi told it are not split. They're not offered in halves. As opposed to the minchas chavit and the kohen gadol, which is half in the morning and half in the afternoon. Lepigul, right? Like any other korban, they're subject to pigul. Shalom b'Shabbos, we don't override the Shabbos for the sake of lachmei toda. As we do with chavite kohen gadol. Shalom b'tuma, we don't bring the korban in a state of tuma. In the case of lachmei toda. Whereas in the case of chavitin and kohen gadol, we could bring it even bituma. So what says Hadarab? Let's go back to chavite kohen gadol. Chavite kohen gadol. Why shekain isaron? Right, the amount of flour you need is an isaron. I think we're going to get to that in tomorrow's daf. The Korban told us we could acquire 20 Yisaron. Anyway, Kli, right? You need a sakin, meaning the kiddush of the lachme toda is after the shechita of the korban toda. Menachos and chavite kohen gadol are subject to kiddush when they're put into a klisharis. Hegdesh, right? Menachos have the status of kodshe kodshim, and chavitim are kodshe kodshim. Korban toda is only kodshim kalim; it's only like a shlomim. Levona, right? We have to add levona to all menachos and to chavitim v'kohen gadol. Matzah, like all menachos are made of matzah, so to the chavitim kohen gadol are made of matzah. As opposed to lachmei toda, with 10 out of the 40 lechamim are chametz. That's a very unusual case. The etzem, right? We're not talking about lachmei toda that accompany a korban toda, but rather we're talking about a korban that comes on its own. The mincha comes on its own, and chavita kohen gadol on its own. Ishim, burnt on the mizbeach. Wait a second. That's interesting. I forgot about this. Korban toda is eaten completely either by the kohanim who received truma, and all the balance is eaten by the bailim who brought the korban, and he divvies it up amongst his family and his friends. But nothing in the korban toda, in the lachmei toda, is burnt on the mizbeach. Behind nefishin, and the average mincha has more in common with chaviti kohen gadol than it has with the korban toda. So the Gemara says no. Despite that, we're still going to use the korban toda as a paradigmic case and conclude that you need 10 lechamim. Why? Because hedjot off odifle. The chavitin are brought by the kohen gadol. That's unusual. We're talking about a hedjot. Any person who's bringing a korban toda. So menachos, in that sense, is hedjot. It doesn't have to do with the kohen gadol, and therefore it's similar to the lachmei toda. Rabbi Meir Omer kulan bo shtei. Our paradigm is not going to be toda, which is only 10, but rather it's going to be the lechem aponim, which is 12. And the only cases where Rabbi Meir admits that it's going to be 10, that's only the korban toda, and as we said before, the siyum hanazirus. Frekti Gemara, my kasava. So the Shita Mekubetzes takes out these words because my kasava sounds like you're introducing a kasha. This is not a kasha, but rather is related davar alam v'gzeres shavachos v'lami binyanav yolef mechavite kohen gadol tahani nefishin. But is related davar alam v'gzeres shava eno choser v'lami binyanav yolef milechem aponim. So Rabbi Meir has two options to derive the conclusion that all menachos require 12 lachamim. Each option will stand on its own according to one shita in the machlokas about how to derive halachas in kodshim. If you have more of a leniency and you could be choser malamed from something that you learn big Xerishav, then we could derive it from Chavite Kohen Gadol. Because we said that Chavite Kohen Gadol require 12 lachamim because of the Xerishav between Chavite Kohen Gadol and the Lechem Aponim. And now Rabbi Meir is going to extend that Xerishav through the process of binyanav to establish that every mincha requires 12 lachamim. But there's another way of interpreting Rabbi Meir. Even if I hold a davar lamim v'gzer shava eino chosim alamed, then we can do it straight with a binyanav, and that's called yolef milechem upon, because all the other menachos are similar to the minchas chavitin of Kohen Gadol, and to the lechem aponim. Now the Gemara adds hegdesh me hegdesh odifle. Okay. Chutz mi lachme todu naziris shem bos is Rabbi Meir eser. So those are the exceptions to the general rule, as we derived it from the lechem aponim and the chavita of a Kohen Gadol is 12. So the Gemara says, I understand that lachme toda should be an exception and only require 10 because behedjik sivbahu. The Torah says explicitly, I'll read the pasuk again. V'hikri v'imenu echad mikol karban truma l'Hashem. And we have a gzeres shava to trumas maser. So that gives you the number 10. Nazirus. How do we know that Nazirus is 10? 10 lechavim. Diomar mar shlomov in the parsha of Toda is an extra word, and L'Rabbos comes to include Shalmei Nozer. Amar of Tuvi bar Chris Amar Shmuel, Lachmei Toda Shafon Arba Chalos Yotza. Wow. Radical shita of Shmuel, that you need only one challah of representative of each of the 4 categories in order to fulfill your mitzvah. At least b'diavad, but you're affecting Marva be'inan arboim, le-mitzvah. Shmuel understands that the arboim, meaning the extra 9 in each of the 4 categories, is only le-mitzvah, but it's not essential. Affecting Marva boy afrushe truma minayu. Right, and we know that truma is 1/10 in the case of Lachmei Toda, which we derive from Trumas Maser. And what that means is 1/10 of 40 lechamim, which is four that we give to the Kohen. But now you're telling me there are only four lechamim that he's bringing. You'll say, well, we'll take off 1/10 of each of the four. That can't be because echad amar rachmana shelo yitol paros. If you take out 1/10 of each one of the lechamim, you're ending up with a broken loaf. And the Torah says it's got to be echad, it's got to be complete, it's got to be whole. So Gemara answers that for shinug belisha. According to Shmuel, you have the opportunity of being mafresh the truma while it's still in the state of lisha when he's kneading it. And therefore, even if you take off 1/10, you still have enough to make a dough for 4 lechamim. And you gave 1/10 as truma. But now the Gemara raises an objection to Shmuel Meisvei. The Brisa says, "Kol Menachos sheriba b'midas chalosam, o shemiet b'midas chalosam ksheros, chutz mi lechem aponim v'chavite kohen gadol v'lachmei toda unazirus." So you see that lachmei toda require that they be baked in groups of 10, 4 groups of 10, 4 categories. And that would be, according to Shmuel, mi'et b'midas chalosam. And the Gemara says, who, meaning Shmuel,